The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of Moscow's Kremlin, casting shadows that seemed to breathe. On the eve of her wedding, Marfa Sobakina, the chosen bride of Tsar Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, prepared to enter a union that was less a celebration and more a death sentence. Within days, the young woman's body began to waste away. Some whispered poison. Others swore it was the curse of a mad Tsar. And in the end, Marfa's fate would become one of the most haunting tragedies in Russian history. If you are drawn to the forgotten corners of history, the tales that drip with blood, sorrow, and mystery, then subscribe now. Join us as we descend into the dark corridors of power, where love, betrayal, and death often walk hand in hand. The story of Marfa Sobakina cannot be told without first standing in the shadow of the man who sealed her fate. Ivan IV of Russia, the first crowned Tsar, the ruler who earned the epithet the Terrible, was a man shaped by trauma, consumed by paranoia, and addicted to absolute power. To understand why a young bride would wither away under his gaze, we must first descend into the labyrinth of his mind, where cruelty was as natural as breath. Ivan was born in 1530, a prince of Moscow, into a court that was little more than a viper's nest. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent, but her sudden death, widely believed to have been caused by poison, left the young Ivan exposed to the claws of the boyar nobility. In the halls of the Kremlin, Ivan was not raised so much as tormented. He was neglected, humiliated, and abused by the very men who were supposed to guide him. They stripped his household bare, beat his servants, and starved him of warmth and affection. Out of this bleak childhood, a monster was born. Even as a child, Ivan's rage revealed itself in cruel games. He is said to have hurled animals from high towers, delighting in their screams. His eyes, pale and piercing, betrayed a boy who trusted no one. The seed of paranoia had been planted, and it would one day grow into a thorny forest that choked out mercy altogether. By the time Ivan was crowned in 1547 as the first official Tsar of all Russia, he was determined never to be humiliated again. He cloaked himself in the divine right of kingship, claiming his authority came not from men but from God himself. And yet, despite this sacred aura, Ivan's reign quickly revealed his obsession with control. He launched military campaigns to expand his empire, crushing enemies with unrelenting ferocity. But war was only one outlet for his wrath. At home, suspicion was his constant companion. He saw treason lurking behind every smile, betrayal in every whispered conversation. His own court was not a place of trust, but of theater, where nobles bowed low while secretly fearing the swing of the Tsar's axe. It was this paranoia that would eventually consume his household, including the young bride he would one day choose. But Ivan was not simply a tyrant without complexity. For all his cruelty, he was also a man who craved companionship, who longed, in his own twisted way, for loyalty and love. His first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, seemed to offer him a fragile glimpse of peace. By all accounts, Anastasia's influence softened him. She was kind, gentle, and beloved by the people. Under her presence, Ivan was calmer, more rational, and more willing to temper his darker impulses. For 13 years, their marriage offered the illusion of stability. But when Anastasia died in 1560, again, amid whispers of poison, Ivan's sanity cracked like ice on a winter river. His grief curdled into suspicion. He blamed the boyars for murdering her, and his fury unleashed a reign of terror known as the Oprichnina, a period in which the Tsar divided Russia into lands he ruled personally and lands left to his hated nobility. Black-robed horsemen, his personal guard, rode out across the land, leaving trails of ash, blood, and severed heads. From this moment forward, Ivan's heart hardened against the idea of trust. Every woman he chose after Anastasia was not simply a bride but a test. Could they heal his paranoia? Could they serve as balm to his wounded soul? Or would they, too, be swallowed by betrayal? It is here, in this atmosphere of suspicion and death, that Marfa Sobakina enters the stage. She was not merely a girl chosen for her beauty, though by all accounts she was fair, with delicate features and a serene presence. She was also a pawn, caught in the machinery of power where the Tsar's whims could elevate or destroy in equal measure. For Ivan, the choice of a new wife was not a matter of romance but of statecraft, survival, and his own restless demons. To marry the Tsar was not to dream of crowns and silks. It was to stand at the edge of an abyss, where love could so easily turn into suspicion, and suspicion into death. And for Marfa, that abyss would soon open wide. The Kremlin itself mirrored the man who ruled it. Its walls loomed heavy and cold, a fortress of power and menace. Within its chambers, plots and prayers mingled in equal measure. Every banquet could be a celebration or a death sentence. Every goblet of wine might be the last. To step inside as Tsaritsa was to enter a cage gilded with terror. Ivan, in his own way, may have believed he was searching for stability once more, a fragile echo of what he lost with Anastasia. But his heart was a broken weapon, and every woman he touched bore the risk of its edge. In the end, Ivan's search for love was inseparable from his hunger for control, and this contradiction would doom the innocent young Marfa Sobakina before her life as Tsaritsa had even begun. Her tragedy was not a sudden act, but a slow poisoning of body, of trust, of hope. Yet its roots lie here, in the dark soil of Ivan's own childhood, watered by blood and betrayal, until he became the shadow under which all of Russia trembled. And as that shadow lengthened over Moscow, it reached for Marfa, the bride whose wedding night would end not in joy, but in mourning. In the 16th century, the choosing of a Tsar's bride was no simple courtship. It was not flowers exchanged in gardens, nor whispered vows in candlelit halls. In Russia, the process was as much ritual as it was political, a performance of power in which the fate of countless young women hinged upon a single man's decision. For Ivan IV, it was also a test of loyalty and control, a way to remind the nobility that even the lives of their daughters belonged to him. The tradition of the bride show was both theatrical and cruel. Across the vast reaches of Ivan's realm, the most eligible young women were summoned to Moscow. Daughters of noble families, provincial gentry, and wealthy merchants were all called, each one plucked from her family's hearth with promises of glory. Their names were written, their lineages scrutinized, their health assessed with cold calculation. It was not love that mattered, but bloodlines, alliances, and, above all, the Tsar's mercurial desires. Imagine the scene. The Kremlin buzzing with nervous energy, the stone courtyards echoing with the sounds of carriages arriving one after another. Mothers whispered prayers as they handed their daughters into the hands of guards. Fathers stood stiffly, bowing low, knowing that to be chosen meant untold honor, yet also unimaginable risk. The young women themselves were dressed in their finest silks, their hair braided and adorned with ribbons, their cheeks flushed not with romance but with dread. For behind the shimmering veils of possibility lurked a darker truth. The Tsar's favor could elevate them to the highest throne in Russia, but his suspicion could just as easily condemn them to disgrace or death. Marfa Sobakina was among them. She came from a family of merchants, not the highest nobility, but wealthy and respected enough to be considered. Her beauty was noted quickly, her bearing serene, her modesty praised. Some say she had a gentleness about her, a quiet dignity that seemed to calm the air around her. Others whispered that her health was fragile even before she entered the Tsar's gaze, that her body bore the seeds of sickness that would soon bloom. Whether truth or rumor, such whispers were quickly drowned beneath the roar of Ivan's will. The Tsar presided over the bride show with the eyes of a predator scanning a field of prey. He inspected not just faces but gestures, the tilt of a head, the grace of a step. His physicians prodded and examined, ensuring that each girl was capable of bearing children. For what Ivan craved most was heirs to secure his dynasty. Behind the curtain of ceremony, the scrutiny was invasive, reducing these young women to vessels for power. It was said that Ivan walked slowly among them, his gaze lingering on Marfa longer than most. Whether it was her beauty that caught his attention or some flicker of softness that reminded him of his lost Anastasia, no one could say. What is certain is that he chose her. Out of all the glittering daughters of Russia, it was Marfa Sobakina who would wear the crown of Tsaritsa. For her family, the announcement was both triumph and terror. To have one's daughter chosen was to ascend into history, but also to be bound to the unpredictable temper of the terrible Tsar. Still, they could not refuse. To decline such an honor was unthinkable, perhaps even treasonous. And so Marfa was delivered into Ivan's world, where her name would forever be tied to tragedy. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with preparations. Jewels were brought out of the treasury, silks embroidered with golden thread. Priests blessed the union, bells rang in Moscow's cathedrals, and the people whispered of the new Tsaritsa. Yet beneath the gilded surface, unease simmered. For even before the wedding, Marfa's health began to falter. She grew pale, her strength seemed to ebb. Some said she was poisoned, perhaps by rival families hoping to ruin the Sobakin's rise. Others believed Ivan's enemies sought to strike at him through his bride. Still others, with crueler tongues, whispered that the Tsar himself had ensured her weakness, for reasons only he could fathom. Whatever the truth, the girl chosen to be Russia's empress was fading before her crown was even placed upon her head. Ivan saw her decline with a mind already poisoned by paranoia. To him, it was proof that treachery lingered everywhere. He accused boyars, healers, and even her attendants of conspiring against him. Yet, despite her frailty, he pressed forward with the marriage. Perhaps it was stubborn pride, perhaps obsession, perhaps the twisted notion that to halt now would signal weakness. Whatever the reason, the wedding was arranged. Even as Marfa grew thinner, her face ghostly, her body weakened by forces unseen. When the day finally came, Moscow celebrated outwardly, but fear curled like smoke through the crowds. The streets glittered with banners, bells tolled, and yet the bride was pale as death. Her steps were slow, her gaze distant, as if she were already being drawn away from the world of the living. The union was consecrated by the church, but it was not a marriage of joy. It was a ritual performed under the shadow of doom. Those who saw her said Marfa looked like a bride from a funeral procession rather than a wedding feast. The crown placed upon her head seemed to weigh her down instead of raising her. And in the days that followed, her decline only quickened. The Kremlin was filled not with laughter but with whispers. Physicians tried their remedies, priests offered prayers, but nothing could save her. And Ivan, consumed by rage, began to lash out. He demanded answers, demanded blood, demanded vengeance against those he imagined responsible. For in his mind, Marfa's suffering was not illness but treason, not fate but betrayal. Thus, the bride chosen to bring peace to the Tsar's tormented heart instead became the spark that reignited his fury. Marfa Sobakina, the girl plucked from a family of merchants, had been lifted to the heights of power, only to be struck down almost immediately by forces no one could stop. The bride show, which promised glory, had become her death sentence. And soon, the wedding bed itself would turn into a tomb. The Kremlin, in the days following Marfa Sobakina's wedding, was a place of uneasy silence. Outside, the bells had already ceased their celebration, the banners taken down, the feasts replaced with murmurs. Inside the palace walls, a single truth spread like frost. The new Tsaritsa was dying. Her decline was rapid and mysterious. Only days after the vows were spoken, Marfa grew too weak to rise from her bed. Her skin turned ashen, her once bright eyes dulled, and her body wasted as though something inside her had been poisoned. She shivered even beneath heavy furs, her lips cracked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The young bride of Russia, chosen with such ceremony, seemed to be fading back into shadows before her reign could even begin. But in Ivan's court, illness was never simply illness. To the Tsar, who saw treason in every corner, Marfa's condition could not be a coincidence. It had to be treachery, and so began the whispers of poison. The very word carried a terrible weight in 16th century Russia. Poison was not merely a weapon. It was a ghostly assassin, unseen and untraceable, a crime that could be committed without blade or blood. In a court as paranoid as Ivan's, the fear of poison haunted every goblet of wine, every plate of food, every vial of medicine. To fall ill in the Kremlin was to invite suspicion that someone, somewhere, wished you dead. Ivan clung to this belief with violent certainty. He raged against the boyars, accusing noble families of corrupting his bride's dowry with toxins meant to rob him of happiness. He turned his fury upon healers, claiming their potions were poisons disguised as remedies. He even eyed Marfa's own family with suspicion, wondering if her sudden decline was a scheme to place blame upon him. The dowry, which should have been a symbol of wealth and alliance, now became the imagined source of her death. Chests filled with silks, jewels, and fine garments were seen not as gifts, but as potential vessels of treachery. Ivan's guards inspected every item, every fabric, every vial of oil or perfume. They searched for powders hidden in seams, for tinctures infused into ointments, for invisible threads of betrayal woven into the offerings of the Sobekins. Yet no proof was ever found. The dowry remained what it had always been, glittering treasures meant to adorn at Tsaritsa. Still, Ivan's suspicion refused to fade. To him, the absence of evidence was evidence itself, proof of a conspiracy so subtle it evaded even the sharpest eyes. Meanwhile, Marfa's body continued to betray her. Witnesses described her lying motionless for hours, her breathing shallow, her skin so pale she seemed carved of wax. The wedding feast, once prepared for joy, sat uneaten. The marriage bed, meant to secure the dynasty with heirs, became a place of suffering. Servants crept through the halls in dread, for to be called before the Tsar during this time was to risk accusation, and punishment could come as swiftly as the slash of an axe. Priests were summoned to bless her chambers, their chants echoing against the cold walls. Incense hung thick in the air, mingling with the bitter smell of herbs burned by healers. But neither prayers nor potions could slow her decline. Each day, Marfa grew weaker, as if her very life had been stolen drop by drop. And through it all, Ivan seethed. His grief, once tender in his first marriage to Anastasia, had now hardened into paranoia. He stormed through the palace, demanding names, demanding culprits. To lose another wife, and so soon after the wedding, was unbearable to him, not merely for the sorrow of loss but for the wound it carved into his pride. A Tsar could not be humiliated, and to Ivan, this illness was nothing less than humiliation itself. Rumors spiraled through Moscow like smoke. Some whispered that the Sobekin family had enemies who sought revenge by striking at their daughter. Others believed rival noble houses had tried to sabotage the marriage to prevent the rise of a merchant's child to the throne. There were darker whispers still, that Ivan himself, consumed by cruelty and suspicion, had ordered her poisoned, testing her purity or punishing imagined betrayal before the union had even begun. The truth remains uncertain, shrouded in centuries of speculation. Historians debate whether Marfa's death was caused by poison, by illness, or by the brutal medical practices of the age. Some suggest that the herbal treatments given to strengthen her may have, in fact, hastened her decline, the very medicines intended to heal instead working as slow poisons. Others point to tuberculosis or another wasting disease, which could have been mistaken for foul play in an era when suspicion was more powerful than science. But in Ivan's court, perception mattered more than fact. To him, poison was real and it demanded vengeance. The poisoned dowry became a symbol, a convenient scapegoat for his rage, and soon the Kremlin's walls echoed not only with the groans of a dying Tsaritsa, but with the cries of those accused. Torture chambers filled, executions followed, and the cycle of terror that defined Ivan's reign grew sharper still. And Marfa, the innocent at the center of it all, faded quietly, her name already becoming less her own and more a weapon wielded by others. She was a bride without joy, a queen without a crown, a life extinguished before it could ever fully shine. Her dowry, intended to secure her future, had instead become the metaphor of her death, a poisoned legacy she never asked for and could never escape. The Tsaritsa of Russia lay dying, and the Tsar of Russia grew mad with rage. What began as a wedding celebration was transforming into a funeral procession. And as Ivan's fury burned hotter, the city of Moscow would once again learn what it meant to live under the reign of a man who trusted no one. For if Marfa Sobekina had been poisoned, then no heart in the Kremlin was safe. The bells that rang across Moscow on the day of Marfa Sobakina's wedding were meant to herald joy. Their iron voices boomed over the city's spires and market squares, summoning nobles, priests, and courtiers to witness the union of Tsar Ivan IV and his chosen bride. But for those who stood close enough to see Marfa as she entered the cathedral, their hearts sank. For beneath her jewels and silks, the Tsaritsa looked less like a bride and more like a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her steps unsteady. The heavy gown of golden brocade dragged behind her, a weight her fragile body seemed unable to carry. Servants whispered that she had been unable to eat for days, that every morsel brought to her lips only deepened her weakness. And yet, there she was, bound to walk the path expected of her. A lamb led not to a feast but to a sacrificial altar. The ritual proceeded as tradition demanded. The Metropolitan of Moscow stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he raised the cross. The vows were spoken, the crowns of gold placed upon the heads of Tsar and Tsaritsa. But where other brides glowed with nervous anticipation, Marfa trembled, her gaze vacant, her lips pressed thin as though she were bracing against unseen pain. Those present later recalled the moment with unease. Some swore that Tsar's eyes never left her, scanning her every movement with a mix of desire and suspicion. Others whispered that Ivan's face, once briefly softened by the sight of Anastasia, had hardened into stone, betraying only the paranoia gnawing at him. For him, the ceremony was not merely a holy union. It was a test of loyalty, of strength, of destiny itself. When the final prayers were spoken, the newlyweds were led to the banquet prepared in their honor. Long tables groaned with roasted meats, honeyed cakes, goblets of wine, and gilded platters of delicacies brought from far-off lands. Musicians struck up lively tunes, jesters prepared their antics, and the air should have been filled with laughter. But the bride remained silent, her appetite gone, her body too weak to taste even a sip of wine. Ivan noticed. His rage simmered beneath the surface. What should have been a night of consummation, the night when bride and groom sealed their union and began the promise of heirs, became a night of suspicion. Marfa, too frail to fulfill her duties, was carried from the banquet hall to her chambers. Instead of a marriage bed filled with passion, hers became a bed of sickness. The silken sheets smelled not of love but of sweat and medicine. The wedding had become a funeral in slow motion. Day by day, Marfa's condition worsened. She slipped in and out of fevered delirium, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Ivan paced the corridors outside her chambers, his boots striking against the cold stone floors, his thoughts poisoned by suspicion. He demanded answers from doctors, priests, and servants alike, but none could explain the mystery of her decline. Physicians bled her, dosed her with bitter tinctures, and burned herbs in her room until the air grew thick with smoke. Holy men sprinkled her bed with holy water, chanting prayers against demons and curses. Yet nothing eased her suffering. To Ivan, this was no mere illness. It was proof of betrayal, proof that his enemies had once again crept too close. The Kremlin trembled under his wrath. Nobles were dragged before him, interrogated, and accused of conspiring to destroy his happiness. Torturers worked without rest, wringing confessions from the broken bodies of men and women who may have known nothing at all. Fear spread like wildfire, consuming all who lived under his shadow. Meanwhile, Marfa lay dying. She was only 19 years old. In another life, she might have grown into her role, learning to navigate the treacherous politics of the Kremlin, perhaps even softening Ivan's cruelty as Anastasia once had. But fate or poison denied her that chance. Instead, she dwindled before the eyes of her attendants, a figure of sorrow whose name would forever be tied to tragedy. The Tsar himself was torn between grief and fury. Some claimed he sat by her bedside at times, watching her pale hands twitch in fevered sleep, muttering prayers to the god he both revered and feared. Others claimed he was cold, that he had already turned his mind to vengeance rather than mourning, his heart so calcified by paranoia that even in Marfa's suffering, he saw only a reflection of his enemy's plots. And then, as swiftly as she had declined, Marfa was gone. Only 15 days after her wedding, the young Tsaritsa of Russia took her final breath. The bells of Moscow rang again, but this time they tolled not for celebration but for death. Her funeral was somber, though overshadowed by the spectacle of Ivan's rage. The people wept for her, but they also feared the storm that her death had unleashed. For Ivan did not simply grieve, he hunted. The court became a theater of blood, as the Tsar lashed out at those he held responsible, whether evidence existed or not. The bride who should have been the jewel of Russia instead became its latest sacrifice. Her marriage bed had become her coffin, her crown, a shroud, and Ivan the Terrible, now widowed yet again, was left with nothing but his fury. The union meant to heal his fractured heart had ended in death and suspicion. The Kremlin, once alive with the sounds of feasting, now echoed with the cries of the condemned. In the span of a fortnight, joy had been transfigured into terror. A wedding had turned into mourning. And from this tragedy, the Tsar's reign of suspicion and violence would only grow darker still. The Kremlin was still draped in black when Ivan's fury began to spill over its walls. The scent of incense from Marfa Sobakina's funeral lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic stench of fear. Bells had tolled for the young Tsaritsa, but now they seemed to toll for Russia itself. Ivan had buried his bride, but he could not bury his suspicion. In his mind, Marfa's sudden decline was no act of nature. No fever, no frailty. It was murder, treachery wrapped in silk, and someone, perhaps many, had poisoned his happiness. The only question was, who? The Tsar summoned his boyars, dragging them from their estates and gilded halls into the storm of his grief. They gathered in the great chamber, their faces pale, their jeweled robes rustling like frightened birds' wings. Ivan's gaze swept over them, sharp and unrelenting. He spoke not as a grieving husband, but as a hunter who had scented blood. "You think me blind," he thundered, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceilings. "You think you can slip poison into the cup of the Tsar himself and go unpunished? You mistake me for a fool." No one dared answer. To speak was to risk accusation. To remain silent was to be marked by suspicion. The boyars bowed their heads, trembling beneath the weight of Ivan's stare. Then the arrests began. Noblemen who only days before had danced at the wedding feast were seized by guards and dragged to the dungeons. Servants who had brushed Marfa's hair, who had poured her wine, who had carried trays of food, were hauled away for questioning. Torturers prepared their instruments, heating irons and sharpening blades. The walls of the Kremlin soon echoed with screams. Confessions, true or imagined, spilled from broken lips. Under the pressure of fire and steel, the accused admitted to poisoning Marfa, to conspiring against the Tsar, to plots that may never have existed. Names were given, and those names led to more arrests, more torture, more death. Ivan's fury was not contained within the palace. It seeped into the streets of Moscow, then across the breadth of Russia. His paranoia had found fresh fuel, and the flames spread without mercy. Everywhere, he saw enemies lurking in the shadows. Boyars who longed for his throne, foreign agents bribing his court, priests who prayed for his downfall. The seeds of the Oprichnina, the dark machinery of terror that would define Ivan's later reign, began to take root here. In the wake of Marfa's death, Ivan decided that ordinary justice was too weak, too tainted by noble blood. He needed his own weapon, loyal only to him, unbound by law or mercy. And so the Tsar unleashed a new kind of fear. Clad in black, mounted on black horses, carrying severed dogs' heads as symbols of their vigilance, the Oprichniki became the embodiment of Ivan's wrath. They hunted where he commanded, tortured where he suspected, killed where he pointed. With each act of brutality, Ivan fed the shadow that had grown inside him since Anastasia's death, the belief that only terror could keep Russia loyal. But vengeance did not heal him. At night, the Tsar was said to wander the corridors of the Kremlin, his steps restless, his prayers muttered in half-mad tones. Some swore they heard him calling Marfa's name, his voice breaking like a child's. Others claimed he raged alone in his chamber, smashing goblets and tearing at icons, demanding to know why God had cursed him again. Those closest to him lived on a knife's edge. One day he might bestow gifts and favors, recalling fondly the loyalty of a servant. Next, he might accuse that same man of treason and send him to the stake. His grief had become a weapon, one he wielded without restraint. Outside the Kremlin, the people whispered. They pitied Marfa, the bride who had never lived to be a queen. They feared their Tsar, who seemed possessed not only by anger but by demons of suspicion that no priest could banish. Some dared to murmur that Marfa's death had driven him further into madness. Others dared not murmur at all. The church, too, watched uneasily. The metropolitan who had crowned Marfa could not deny that her death had marked a turning point. The marriage bed turned coffin had unleashed a storm that swept through the holy and unholy alike. Priests were dragged into interrogations, their loyalty questioned, their words weighed like coin. Ivan no longer trusted even God's emissaries to speak the truth. The spiral was unstoppable. Each execution birthed more accusations. Each drop of blood called for another. The wedding that had been meant to bind Russia's future instead unleashed a tide of death that stained its soil. And yet, even as he lashed out, Ivan could not escape the shadow of loss. Anastasia had been his anchor, the one who softened his heart and steadied his rule. Marfa had been his attempt to grasp at that warmth again, but she had slipped through his fingers before he could even hold her. Now, with both women gone, only rage remained. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in Russian history. Ivan's wrath, once tempered by love, was unleashed without restraint. It would consume nobles, servants, towns, and entire regions. It would define him in the eyes of his people, not as a ruler chosen by God, but as a tyrant driven by grief, suspicion, and bloodlust. The Tsar had lost a bride, but Russia had lost far more. The bells of Moscow no longer rang with celebration. Their heavy toll had become a summons to death, announcing not weddings or coronations, but the latest executions commanded by the Tsar. Out of Marfa Sobakina's poisoned bridal chamber, something monstrous had been born. It was not a child of flesh, but a creation of fear, the Oprichnina. The year was 1565, and Ivan, broken by grief and twisted by paranoia, stood before the stunned nobility of Russia to declare his reign would no longer be bound by the old order. He divided his realm into two. One half he left to the traditional structures of government, a withering remnant of boyar authority. The other half he claimed as his own private dominion, a state within a state, ruled not by law but by his wrath. This was the Oprichnina. The boyars trembled. To be excluded was to lose wealth, land, and influence. To be included was worse. It meant living under Ivan's gaze, trapped in a world of suspicion, bound to the Tsar's vengeance. The Oprichniki, his chosen brotherhood of terror, rode forth like specters of death. Dressed head to toe in black, their saddles marked with severed dogs' heads and brooms, they proclaimed their mission: to sniff out treachery and sweep it away. Their mere arrival in a village was enough to send families fleeing into the forests, abandoning homes to the flames. Children wept as fathers were dragged from hearths. Mothers begged for mercy, only to be silenced by the crack of a whip. No estate was safe. The boyars, once proud lords of Russia, now found their halls stormed by these grim riders. Treasures were looted, walls torn down, libraries burned to ash. Ivan's paranoia had made property itself a crime. Wealth was proof of betrayal, influence a sign of rebellion. The greatest names in Russia's history crumbled under the Tsar's fury. The executions were theatrical, designed not only to kill but to crush the spirit. Men were boiled alive, women paraded naked before jeering mobs, and entire families were slaughtered before each other's eyes. Ivan himself often watched, sometimes even joining in the torture with grim fascination. In his eyes, this was not cruelty, it was purification. Russia, he believed, could only be saved through blood. Yet beneath the terror lay a hollow truth. The Oprichnina was not only a weapon against treason, it was a balm for Ivan's grief. With Anastasia and Marfa gone, the Tsar's heart had calcified into suspicion. Love had failed him, vengeance never would. Each execution was a twisted ritual of mourning, each scream an offering to the wound he could never close. But Russia groaned under the weight of his grief. Fields went untended as peasants fled from the Oprechnicky's wrath. Towns fell silent, their markets empty, their churches desecrated. Commerce withered, and famine crept across the land. The once proud state, so carefully built, began to rot from within. The clergy, too, felt the sting of Ivan's black dominion. Monks who dared question the Oprechnina's savagery found themselves chained and beaten. Icons were torn from monasteries, relics desecrated. Some whispered that the Tsar no longer sought God's blessing but his punishment, as if daring heaven to strike him down. And still Ivan pressed forward. To the Oprechniky, he granted lands stripped from the boyars, turning thieves into lords and peasants into spies. Their loyalty was bought with blood and terror, their brotherhood sealed by the Tsar's promise of power. They became not merely enforcers, but priests of Ivan's new religion of fear. The people, caught between silence and death, whispered stories to explain what their Tsar had become. Some said the devil had entered him after Anastasia's death, whispering suspicions into his ear. Others claimed Marfa's poisoned body had cursed him, binding his soul to vengeance. Whatever the truth, Russia's ruler had turned against his own kingdom, and the Oprechnina was his instrument. The climax of this reign of terror came in Novgorod. The city, proud and wealthy, was accused of conspiring with foreign powers. Ivan arrived with his black-clad army, and for weeks the city drowned in blood. Priests were slaughtered on church steps, women and children thrown into the frozen Fokhov River, merchants stripped and executed in their marketplaces. The air filled with the stench of burning bodies, the river clogged with corpses beneath the ice. By the time Ivan departed, Novgorod was not a city but a graveyard. The Oprechnina had fulfilled its purpose, not to protect Russia, but to devastate it. The nobility was broken, the people cowed, the land scarred beyond repair. And yet, even after rivers of blood, Ivan remained restless. The specter of betrayal never left him. The death of Marfa, the second bride he had lost to poison and fate, lingered like a shadow at the edge of his throne. And so the Oprechnina endured, not as a safeguard but as a reminder. The Tsar was untouchable, his pain eternal, his vengeance infinite. Russia had not only gained an empire of fear, it had lost the last remnants of its innocence. The winter of 1570 froze Russia in silence, but beneath the ice of the Fokhov River, whispers carried like fire. Ivan IV, already consumed by grief and suspicion, had turned his gaze upon Novgorod, one of Russia's oldest and proudest cities. To him, it was no jewel of trade or faith. It was a nest of traitors, a city of merchants who fattened themselves while his throne trembled. Rumors, perhaps real, perhaps conjured by the Tsar's paranoia, told of secret alliances with Lithuania, of hidden boyar plots to betray the crown. When Ivan's black riders approached, Novgorod's bells rang not in celebration but in dread. The Oprechniky rode in grim silence, their horses' hooves muffled by snow, their saddles adorned with grotesque tokens. Dogs' heads to sniff out treachery, brooms to sweep it clean. Behind them trailed wagons laden not with food or supplies, but with chains, hooks, and racks. Novgorod was not to be judged. It was to be cleansed. The city gates opened under the weight of inevitability. No army could stand against the Tsar's wrath. No plea could soften his heart. He entered Novgorod like a conqueror, cloaked in furs, his eyes burning with feverish suspicion. The cathedral bells tolled, but their holy chimes did nothing to still his fury. For 5 weeks, Novgorod became a theater of death. The executions began at the very steps of St. Sophia's Cathedral. Priests who dared intercede were beaten, their icons torn from their hands, their bodies dragged through the snow. Some were hung upside down at the altar, their blood dripping onto the stones where generations had prayed. The house of God became a slaughterhouse. Merchants were accused of hoarding wealth, of selling loyalty to foreign kings. Their wives and daughters were stripped and paraded through the streets before the jeering Oprechniky. Many were dragged to the Fokhov River, where holes were hacked into the ice. Whole families were bound together and hurled into the black water, their screams swallowed by the freezing current. Mothers clutched their infants as the ice closed above them, their bodies drifting beneath like shadows in a frozen mirror. The Oprichniki showed no mercy. Their cruelty was not only sanctioned, it was encouraged. They devised tortures that stretched beyond imagination. Men roasted alive in iron cauldrons, women beaten with iron rods, children forced to watch their parents dismembered before their eyes. To Ivan, this was purification. To the people, it was the undoing of their world. The air grew thick with the stench of burning timber and flesh as houses were looted and torched. The cries of the dying mingled with the crackle of fire and the howls of dogs gnawing at corpses. Snow, once pristine and white, turned red with blood and black with ash. Ivan himself presided over the carnage, often watching from horseback as his Oprichniki carried out their work. Some accounts claim he ordered executions personally, striking with his own hands to prove his devotion to vengeance. Others tell of his cold detachment, as if he were no longer man but executioner incarnate, fulfilling a destiny written in blood. And yet, for all the cruelty, the massacre was not random. Ivan's suspicion guided every blade. He targeted boyars first, stripping them of estates and titles, ensuring no noble house could challenge his reign. Then came the merchants, the clergy, and finally the common folk. Anyone accused, anyone suspected, anyone unlucky enough to catch the Tsar's eye. By the end of his campaign, Novgorod was broken. Tens of thousands were dead, their bodies buried in mass graves or lost beneath the ice. The Fokhov River, once a lifeline of trade and faith, became a graveyard of souls, its waters choked with corpses. Survivors staggered through the ruins like phantoms, their voices hollow, their spirits crushed. The economic heart of Russia lay shattered. Novgorod's trade routes collapsed, its markets emptied, its once proud merchants ruined. The city that had rivaled Moscow in wealth and culture was reduced to ashes, its legacy erased in weeks. Where songs and prayers had once filled the air, only silence remained. Even the Oprichniki, drunk on blood, were not untouched. Some whispered in secret that Ivan had gone too far, that his vengeance had poisoned Russia itself. But fear sealed their lips, for to question the Tsar was to join the dead. And what of Ivan? To some, he left Novgorod victorious, convinced he had destroyed treachery at its root. But others saw a man hollowed out by grief, chasing shadows of betrayal that would never die. The massacre had not healed the wound of Anastasia or Marfa. It had only widened it, bleeding across his kingdom. The tragedy of Novgorod was more than a massacre. It was a scar upon Russia's soul, a reminder that love lost and paranoia unchained could destroy not just a family, not just a bride, but an entire people. When the snow melted that spring, the Fokhov thawed, releasing bodies that drifted downriver like silent testimonies. Villagers pulled them from the water, burying them without prayers, for even the church feared to bless what the Tsar had cursed. The land wept, but no one dared to speak. Novgorod never recovered. Its voice, once strong, was silenced. Its markets, once bustling, were ruined. Its people, once proud, were broken. And above it all, Ivan's shadow loomed, darker than ever. When Ivan left the smoldering ruins of Novgorod, he carried no triumph in his saddlebag, no trophies to display upon his throne. What he carried instead was silence. The silence of a city extinguished, the silence of thousands of voices drowned beneath the ice. But silence has weight, and it pressed upon him like a specter that would not release its grip. At first, he seemed unshaken. The Oprichniki boasted of their loyalty, riding in grim formation at his side. They sang of the Tsar's might, of how treachery had been scoured from Russia's heart. But even among them, whispers began to stir. They noticed his eyes, distant and unfocused. They saw him riding alone at dusk, speaking under his breath to no one visible. They watched him clasp at his chest as though warding off some invisible hand. For Ivan was haunted. In the echo of cathedral bells, he heard not God's blessing, but the screams of Novgorod's priests. In the cry of an infant, he heard the gasps of children sinking beneath black ice. At night, when the Kremlin should have been hushed, servants swore they heard the Tsar pacing, his footsteps restless, his mutterings fevered. Some said he called out to Anastasia, begging her forgiveness. Others swore they heard him cry Marfa's name, cursing the poison that had stolen her. Dreams tormented him. He saw rivers of blood stretching endlessly across Russia. He saw boyars with faces half-burned, their mouths sewn shut. He saw Anastasia, her skin pale, her lips blue, reaching for him only to vanish when he tried to grasp her hand. Sometimes she smiled at him. Other times her face melted into a mask of decay. He would wake gasping, sweat soaking his robes, calling for priests to banish the demons that clung to his sleep. But the priests could not help him. The church itself, once his refuge, had grown cold. Too many holy men had been slaughtered in Novgorod, too many altars defiled. Ivan sought absolution, but confession gave him no peace. One metropolitan dared suggest repentance, whispering that God's wrath might fall upon a czar who spilled so much blood. Ivan's eyes burned with rage. "It is not I who must repent," he thundered, "but those who betrayed me. I am the hand of God's justice." The metropolitan was stripped of office and sent away in chains. Madness crept upon him like frost on a window pane, slow but unrelenting. He no longer trusted the walls of his own palace. He believed assassins lurked behind the draperies, that poison hid in every goblet of wine. Food tasters quaked before every meal, for Ivan often struck them down at the faintest suspicion of treachery. Even his own sons felt the lash of his paranoia. His eldest, Ivan Ivanovich, once the heir he adored, bore the brunt of his father's shifting moods. There were days of tenderness, when the Tsar would cradle the boy's head and call him his future. But there were darker days when rage overtook him, when Ivan saw in his son's eyes the reflection of betrayal. The line between love and wrath thinned, trembling on the edge of collapse. In public, he still ruled with iron certainty. He still thundered from his throne, still commanded armies, unleashed his oprichniki to sniff out enemies, real or imagined. But in private, he frayed. Servants found him kneeling before icons until his knees bled, whispering prayers so fevered they blurred into curses. They found him clutching relics, pressing them to his chest, as if hoping they might bind his soul together before it shattered. Russia itself began to sense the madness of its ruler. Villages prayed not for the Tsar's health, but for his restraint. Merchants feared his summons more than foreign invasion. Nobles slept with daggers beneath their pillows, knowing that loyalty offered no shield. Mothers warned their children not to speak his name too loudly, lest it carry on the wind to his ears. And yet, amid the terror, Ivan seemed most tormented not by the living, but by the dead. There were nights, it was said, when he called for Anastasia's portrait, staring at it for hours until dawn. He would speak to her as though she were there beside him, confessing his loneliness, his rage, his unending suspicion. "They took you from me," he whispered, "and they will never cease." Sometimes he pressed his lips to the painting, other times he hurled it across the chamber, smashing it in a storm of tears. Marfa's memory was more fleeting, but no less haunting. He dreamed of her wedding veil soaked in blood, of her fragile smile fading into screams. He raged that she had been poisoned, that boyars had once again stolen his bride. Her death, like Anastasia's, became another stone chained to his heart, dragging him deeper into suspicion and despair. In these shadows, Ivan ceased to be merely a ruler. He became a ghost among the living, a man consumed by the very terror he unleashed upon others. He built an empire of fear, but in the silence of night, he was its prisoner. The haunted Tsar walked the halls of the Kremlin like a penitent condemned to wander forever. He was surrounded by guards, priests, servants, and yet he was utterly alone. Love had abandoned him. God had turned his face away. Only blood remained. Blood in his dreams, blood on his hands, blood staining the land he once swore to protect. And so the question lingered in the air, whispered in fearful corners of Russia. Was Ivan still Tsar, or had he become something else? A tyrant, a madman, a soul damned by his own grief? Whatever the answer, one truth was clear. The ghosts of Novgorod and the shadows of his lost brides would never release him. He was a man haunted, and Russia would haunt with him. The Kremlin stone walls had witnessed centuries of triumph and despair, but none so devastating as the moment when a father's hand struck down his own heir. In Ivan IV's life, grief was never still. It grew, multiplied, and consumed everything that dared to love him. By the late 1580s, the Tsar was no longer the young ruler crowned with promise. He was older, heavier, his beard streaked with gray. His eyes sunk deep into hollows carved by sleepless nights and endless suspicion. His body bent beneath the weight of disease and guilt, yet his spirit was more dangerous than ever. The Oprichnina had left Russia scarred, Novgorod had bled, and the nobility lay broken. But even with enemies crushed, Ivan could not escape the shadows in his own mind. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, had grown into a man admired by many. Strong, intelligent, pious, he was everything Russia might have needed for the future. A ruler tempered by his father's madness, yet not consumed by it. The boyars saw in him hope, the church saw in him devotion, and the people whispered that perhaps, when his father's reign ended, salvation would come. But Ivan the Terrible was not a man who bore rivals, not even in his own blood. His love for his son was fierce but poisoned, swinging between moments of tender pride and eruptions of violent suspicion. To Ivan, admiration for his heir smelled of betrayal, and whispers of hope sounded like treason. The tragedy began with the Tsarevich's wife, a young woman heavy with child. Ivan Ivanovich adored her, and with her, he envisioned a future of continuity, a new dawn for Russia. But one day, in a fit of rage, the Tsar stormed into her chambers. Accounts differ. Some say her clothing displeased him, others that she had failed in some duty. What is certain is this: Ivan struck her hard and mercilessly. She collapsed, blood soaking her garments. The unborn child was lost. When Ivan Ivanovich discovered what had happened, he did not shrink back as others had. He did not cower before his father's wrath. Instead, he confronted him, his voice blazing with fury that only grief can ignite. "You have destroyed my wife," he cried. "You have destroyed your grandson. You have destroyed Russia's future." The words cut, but Ivan was not a man who endured reproach. Rage consumed him, twisting grief into madness. He raised his staff, heavy, iron-tipped, and struck his son across the head. The crack echoed through the chamber, louder than any sermon, louder than any prayer. The Tsarevich staggered, blood pouring from his skull, and collapsed into his father's arms. For a moment, silence, then horror. Ivan fell to his knees, clutching his dying son, the staff slipping from his trembling hands. His cries echoed through the Kremlin, cries so raw they seemed to tear from the depths of his soul. "I have killed my son! I have killed my son!" he wailed, rocking back and forth, pressing cloths against the wound that would not close. Servants and boyars rushed in, only to find their Tsar weeping, his robes drenched in his son's blood. The Tsarevich, still conscious, reached weakly for his father. Some chronicles say he forgave him with his final breath, whispering words of peace. Others say he could only gasp, his eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Whatever the truth, the heir to Russia's throne died in his father's arms, his life stolen by the same hand that had given it. The Kremlin descended into mourning, but no grief could match Ivan's own. He raged like a man possessed, tearing at his beard, striking his head against the walls until it bled. He begged priests for miracles, for the power to raise his son from death. He cursed himself, cursed God, cursed the boyars who he imagined had twisted fate against him. But nothing could return the heir, nothing could wash the blood from his hands. News spread like fire across Russia. The people wept, for they had lost not just a prince, but hope itself. The Tsarevich had been a beacon, a promise that one day the madness might end. Now he was gone, and the throne would pass to Fyodor, Ivan's fragile second son, gentle of spirit but weak in health. Russia's future dimmed, clouded by uncertainty and fear. Artists later captured the moment in paint, most famously Ilya Repin centuries later. Ivan cradling his son, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief, his hands soaked in blood. The image would haunt history as much as the act itself, the portrait of a father undone by his own violence. For Ivan, the tragedy became another chain dragging him into the abyss. He had lost Anastasia, he had lost Marfa, he had lost his own soul in Novgorod, and now he had destroyed his heir. The very future of his dynasty lay shattered at his feet, crushed beneath the weight of his rage. The Tsar who had once dreamed of empire, who had crowned himself ruler of all the Russias, now wandered the Kremlin like a broken man, haunted not only by ghosts of wives and victims, but by the specter of his own son. He had unleashed terror upon his people, but the cruelest blow of all had been struck against his own blood. And thus the legend of Ivan the Terrible was sealed, not merely as a tyrant, not merely as a ruler drenched in blood, but as a father who destroyed his own legacy with his own hands. Russia would never forget. The Kremlin grew colder in Ivan's final years, not from the Russian winter alone but from the chill of a ruler whose strength was fading and whose mind was unraveling. The man who had once thundered across battlefields, who had made boyars tremble and entire cities burn, now walked bent, swollen, and racked with pain. His body, once iron, had become a prison of disease. By the late 1580s, Ivan was only in his 50s, but age had carved deep lines into his face. His teeth rotted, his skin sagged, his belly swelled grotesquely with dropsy. He could no longer ride into war or stand tall before his court. He moved instead with difficulty, leaning on staff and servants alike. Yet his eyes, though clouded, still blazed with suspicion, darted from shadow to shadow as though ghosts whispered his name. And ghosts indeed surrounded him. Anastasia, his beloved first wife, was poisoned, perhaps decades earlier. His murdered rivals, his slaughtered boyars, the innocents of Novgorod, drowned in icy rivers. And above them all, his son, Ivan Ivanovich, whose blood had stained the Kremlin floors. The Tsar could not escape them. Night after night, he woke screaming, his chambers echoing with cries for forgiveness that never came. Paranoia consumed him more fiercely than ever. He changed rooms constantly, fearing assassins. He demanded his food be tasted again and again, lest poison hide within it. He had trusted no one for years, but now he trusted not even himself. Priests shuffled in and out of his chambers, hearing his confessions, yet finding him endlessly repeating the same sins, as though hoping repetition might erase them. Despite his decay, Ivan clung to ambition. He still dreamed of conquests, of marrying foreign princesses, of carving his name deeper into history. He sent envoys to England, even toyed with the idea of wedding Elizabeth I, though the Virgin Queen had little interest in sharing her throne with a man so infamous. In Poland and Sweden, he sought alliances and wars alike, restless even as death crept closer. But Russia had grown weary. The Oprichnina had torn the land apart, leaving famine, depopulation, and terror in its wake. The boyars despised him, the people feared him, the church endured him. And yet, for all their hatred, none dared imagine Russia without him. Ivan was terrible, yes, but he was also inevitable. In March of 1584, the Tsar seemed restless in a different way. He demanded his treasures be brought forth. The jewels, the crowns, the icons collected over a lifetime of rule. He would sit for hours among them, running swollen fingers across gold and diamonds, as though these trinkets might remind him he was still Tsar mighty. It was during one of these sessions, legend says, that death found him. On March 18th, Ivan prepared for a game of chess with his trusted statesman, Bogdan Belsky. He lowered himself into his chair with effort, his great bulk shifting uncomfortably. The board was set, the pieces gleaming in the lamplight. For a moment, Ivan appeared almost calm, as though he were merely an aging ruler indulging in a pastime. Then, without warning, he stiffened. His hand froze mid-move. His eyes bulged, and a strangled cry escaped his lips. The Tsar collapsed forward onto the board, scattering the pieces. Kings, bishops, pawns tumbling like his empire's fragile future. Servants rushed to him, but it was too late. The terrible Tsar was gone. Some whispered it was a stroke, others that poison had finally reached him, delivered by the same treacherous hands he had so long feared. His physicians recorded the cause as sudden illness, but in the Kremlin's corridors, rumors spread faster than truth. Perhaps God himself had struck him down, weary of his cruelties. When word spread through Moscow, the reaction was muted. There was no joyous celebration, but neither was there genuine mourning. The people crossed themselves, whispered prayers for their souls, and returned to their daily struggles. For Russia had long since learned to live in terror, and terror does not die easily. Ivan left behind a broken country. His surviving son, Fyodor, was gentle and pious, but frail of body and mind. He was no warrior, no leader. The true power fell instead to Boris Godunov, Fyodor's ambitious brother-in-law, whose hand would steer Russia into the storms of the time of troubles. And so, Ivan's legacy was not merely the blood he spilled or the empire he forged. It was chaos, a dynasty without strength, a throne without certainty, a people scarred by decades of fear. He had crushed his enemies, but in doing so, he had crippled his own house. Centuries later, historians would argue over him. Was he a visionary who sought to modernize Russia, centralize power, and elevate the Tsardom into an empire? Or was he a mad tyrant, whose paranoia and cruelty bled his land dry? The truth, as always, lay in both. Ivan was brilliant, ruthless, pious, and monstrous. A man of contradictions, a ruler who embodied both Russia's strength and its suffering. But in his final moment, sprawled lifeless over a chessboard, he was simply a man. A man who had conquered lands, slaughtered thousands, and crowned himself greater than any before him, and yet who could not conquer himself. The board lay scattered, the game unfinished. And perhaps that was the truest symbol of all. For Ivan the Terrible's life was a game never completed, a kingdom never fully secured, a dynasty doomed by the very hand meant to guide it. His bones were interred in the Archangel Cathedral, among the rulers of Moscow. But his spirit lingered far beyond stone walls and gilded icons. For every tyrant who followed, every ruler who gazed too deeply into the abyss of power, carried a fragment of Ivan's shadow. Russia had endured him, but it would never forget him.